This is Harmony, a Unitarian Universalist community. We are a lay-led congregation based in the northeast suburbs of Cincinnati, balancing faith and reason since 2009.
With that, I'm going to throw it to Doren now. And Doren, if you've got your notes, you can just tell me next slide and I'll move that forward for you and take it away.
Okay, can you hear me, everyone?
Yes.
Okay. So good morning. Happy Labor Day weekend. I'm Doren Cook, and I would like to talk to you today about child welfare, modern child welfare in the foster care system. So I'm going to start with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services of what child welfare is, because that's going to be my overriding theme. It's a continuum of services designed to ensure that children are safe and families have the necessary supports to care for their children successfully. So this topic interests me for a number of reasons. As you all know, Steve and I went through the process of adopting 2 children, Cole and Isaiah. We adopted through a local private agency called Adoption Professionals. So there's many parts to it, but I think of it as 2 parts. It's a personal, emotional journey, which we generally think of as adoption, bringing a family together. It's also a complex legal process, which includes many parts that all have to be fulfilled. So there's the home study, which is the paperwork and the background check and the interviews, and basically proving the right word, that you're ready to have a child come live with you, and also to ready yourself for that to happen. So then there was matching, and we got to find 2 wonderful women who were pregnant and who picked us. So it was hope I don't cry, but it was an amazing experience. But that was what the agency facilitated. So then the babies were born and they were placed with us. And then it's a minimum of 6 months, there's what's called a post-placement visit with a social worker. These are all with professionals in the industry. So that is, I came to know that process because I lived it, and I still, have adopted the 2 boys. And then I also work as a social worker for Lighthouse Youth and Family Services, and which I think a lot of you are familiar. One of the services we provide is foster care. But I don't work in the foster care program. I work for what's called outpatient. So I can be assigned children from foster care, or one who are at risk to be involved in child welfare. Some have been adopted. So I'm at kind of different places on that continuum. So I'm familiar with that. I'm also what's called a trauma-informed therapist, which means I have been trained to work with children who have been abused and neglected. Or have been through other types of trauma, such as been exposed to drugs in utero, or have parents involved in the criminal justice system, etc. Okay, next slide. Okay, like I mentioned, this is sort of a sequel to what Kip talked about, the orphan train, and how she had family members who were involved in it. So I kind of wanted to bring us up to date on how far we've come in terms of child welfare, which it's been a long time, so you'd hope we'd have made some progress, but in terms of meeting the needs of our children. There's been a lot of interest in this period in the 1830s through 1850s and moving forward. This is the start of large-scale child welfare in the U.S. What happened was there were thousands upon thousands of children who were just dropped, who were in big cities like New York and Boston, and there was, so many kids, it was overwhelming. Because who was going to take care of them? How are they going to feed them? And so they kind of had to throw together a child welfare system, and the state eventually had to get involved. So early orphanages, they had their drawbacks, but they were set up to provide basic food, structure, education, just the basic needs of the kids, and limited adoption services. So, a family would come to the orphanage, they would pick out a child, and they would take down their information, and that then they would go home. There wouldn't be a whole lot of follow-up, which of course was concerning in the long run. Okay, next slide. Can everyone see it? Okay. So I have to have a picture of Leo in my presentation, right? The orphan train was, well, let me step back. Another aspect of it that it was difficult then and continues to be difficult is that these children are stigmatized, right? So that there was a negative, they were viewed in a negative way. That we don't know where these kids came from. They have issues. They're problem children. And it's very similar. That is still the case now, especially with older kids. And that finding them families can be difficult because of that. And so the orphan train was an attempt to find families and to kind of expand the reach. And then the reason I have this picture is because this is from the movie Gangs of New York, which kind of portrays that period. So we have these, the kids who are involved in the child welfare system are extremely vulnerable to abuse and neglect, indentured servitude, sex trafficking, crime and court involvement. So really not a lot has changed in that time. We have the same risk factors today as we had then. So next slide. Okay, thank you. All right, so this is not an exhaustive list, but this is kind of like, just thinking about what things had to change for us to do better by these children, how to make sure that they could be successful. So having individual plans, or we call them permanency plans, meaning what's the long-term plan for this kid, not just what's happening right now, but where are we going? Like having professionals, meet different types of professionals meeting together and talking about individual children as well as, larger policies. Having advocacy is important. So government agencies involved, oversight. And then having, like I said, the professionals doing visits, following up, doing documenting, like every child has a file and of what's happened with them, right? That wasn't always the case, but that has improved. So of course, funding is an issue. Like I said, in the early days, there was no money. So figuring out who's going to pay for it. And there's also ethical implications with that as well. And then juvenile justice reform. A lot of these kids are involved in juvenile justice, because they're out on the streets or because they're not getting good structure. So the next slide. So here I have a picture of Jimmy Carter signing going forward to 1980, but he's signing the Adoption Assistance and Welfare Act. But I know I'm jumping way ahead, but over the years, there were a lot of changes in different aspects of child welfare. So that there were a lot of people, this is a bipartisan issue and should be, Jimmy Carter and Richard Nixon were both passionate about children's welfare as well as JFK. So it should be bipartisan, and it should be something that we all view. We need to take care of our children for our society to thrive. So I think there's been a lot of investment in these vulnerable children. So some of these big acts. So I wanted to just quickly kind of say how that works on a government level, because say you have an act like the Adoption Assistance Act. And there's funding attached to that, but then the states each have their own laws regarding adoption. So for example, in Ohio, like John Kasich was very passionate about adoption. So there were some changes made at the state level, like that children could have access to their sealed records. That was a big issue too, because letting kids have information and contact with the birth family used to be unheard of. But we realized that they need to have that information, that contact. So some states are unsealing those records, making it easier. We also had a change a few years ago, I want to say 5 years ago, though we changed the age from 18 to 21. So kids can get, young adults can get services longer because they need those services in order to be successful. Okay. All right, next slide. Go to the next one. Okay, I'm just talking about how we manage child abuse and neglect in our communities. So there has always been a push and pull in the child welfare system between the rights of families to be free of government interference and the rights of children to be raised in a safe and nurturing environment. So we've seen both extremes. Like if you take kids from a loving family because of stigma, say from a single mom who maybe could do well with some supports, that's not doing a service to anyone. We had the famous Georgia Tann is one of the infamous American villains who kidnapped hundreds of children and would have judges in the 30s to 50s, to give a time frame, and would have judges sign off and basically sell them to rich families. So that was an abuse of power. But then the other extreme would be to leave children in families the families are not, or they're abusive, or they're not functional, and they have no intention to change. So we need to, so we've kind of have to meet in the middle and say, when is it appropriate to remove a child, and when it is appropriate to put services into place. So for those they do decide to remove, 93%, the official number is 93% of them have had at least one trauma in their life. I would say it's all of them based on my experience, but I'll go with the official number, that and trauma affects the way that children develop. It affects their behavior. So so that, taking them and putting them in foster care, they need to have the services, and they need to have people who are understanding of that. Let's talk a little bit more about the types of abuses that can lead to a removal, or at least an open case. There's physical abuse, which basically is that the child has a mark on them. Spanking is not considered physical abuse. It's if we see a mark that we have to call in. Emotional abuse can take many forms. Sexual abuse is very serious. Generally, very often will lead to a removal from the home. And it depends on the states. Like I said, every state has their own rules. So did the child see drug activity or witness domestic violence, etc. So there's lots of different things they look at. And then neglect is another aspect of it. Is this child being fed and has appropriate shelter? And just because a child's homeless doesn't mean they're necessarily removed and put in foster care, but shelter is important. Are they getting education, medical care? Are they supervised? Are they wearing clothes? But then also an abandoned child is one who's going to need to find a home as well. So next slide. All right, so how does an investigation work? So many of us, those who work with kids, are what's called mandated reporters. So if we suspect or abuse or neglect are reported to us, we must call it into the county children's service office. And the public at large is encouraged to call in. It is a confidential call. They've made it very easy. You just call the number and talk to the person and tell them just what you have seen, just basic factual information, I should say. And so then the next morning, at least in Hamilton County, it works that they review all the cases, all the phone calls from the previous day, and they decide which ones they will investigate. And this is based on if what they know about the family. Often there's already a file on this family and they might have information already. It might be the kind of what the allegation is. Sexual abuse would be very serious, so they would generally investigate that. And then the credibility of the person calling in, etc. So they would kind of look at all those factors, decide if they're going to send a CPS or social worker out to the home to interview the child, to talk to the caregiver and the person who the allegations are against. If they decide the child is in imminent harm, and that's something they learn in their training, these are trained social workers, that they can remove them with a court order. They can get ahead of time, or they can get, if they go into the home, decide they need to take the kid right then, they can go to court the next day and they can have a judge sign it. But a judge has to sign this in order for a child to be removed from their family. Next slide. Okay. So in the US, right now, there's about 425,000 kids in foster care, according to Health and Human Services. I'm not exactly sure how COVID is affecting that, but I can imagine it had a negative impact. So, and this is kind of looking at where these kids are who are in care, as we often put it. So a little less than half of them are with non-relative foster homes, and that could be just for a few days, like a transition process. It could be for months or years, and some of them will be adopted. About a quarter go to what's called kinship care, which is often kids will end up being with their extended family. So maybe grandma or aunt might take them in and just hope that that family member is, more stable, can provide a safe home than the birth parents, I should say. And then there's a few other other possible places they could be: a group home or supervised residential would be more for kids who have significant mental health needs and are struggling in foster care. So they might be in a more structured environment like that. There's about 2% at any given time we don't know where they are, and like they'll sing that song today about runaways. Some just get scared and they run away, and then we try to find them, hope that the police can find them and we can find a different placement or figure out what's going wrong there. Okay, next slide. Okay, I asked the question about our foster parents are superheroes, and I'm gonna say yes, they are, because of course that was the answer I was gonna give. I said that on my blurb. They are amazing people. This really is a public service to take care of these children, and I can't say enough about them. I know there's a lot of negativity regarding the system or foster care, foster placements, but I don't think that's warranted. On the whole, these people, foster parents go through quite a bit. They do more extensive home study than I did. They do more trainings on things like abuse and attachment, and different mental health issues. It's a significant training they go through, and they have, the fire department come and look at their house and see if it's a place to have children. So it is what we're doing is we're taking a child and putting them in a house with someone they don't know, and so that there's that difficulty in that transition. The child often has trauma that they're working through, and so these foster parents are great at helping them work through that and providing safety and compassion to them. But, there's times when it just doesn't quite work out, or so they can put in what's called a 30-day transfer, so there can be adequate time to find a new placement and help the child work through that, because it's traumatic. It's traumatic for them to be taken from their family of origin, and can be traumatic to be moved to a second home. So we look at all of that and do the best we can to find placements for the kids. I also want to talk a little bit about all the people who are involved with these children, and there are quite a few of us who work with foster kids. So we've got the foster family, we've also got the JFS social worker, and then the case might be referred to someone like Beach Acres or Lighthouse if the child has mental health needs. So we'll get someone like me, a therapist, and then a case manager, sort of the person I work with, to provide them resources. Often there's a psychiatrist involved or another kind of doctor. And there's called the GAL, the guardian ad litem, is an attorney assigned to each child, gets an attorney. And many of them have what's called a CASA worker, court-appointed special advocate, who are volunteers. Not to mention mentors like big brothers and big sisters, and hopefully they're involved with their birth family and have ongoing communication with somebody in their birth family, because we know that helps the children to be able to adjust, to still have communication with them. And I can't say enough about our school staff. They do an amazing job with these kids. Their teachers, their counselors, their psychologists, getting them on IEPs if they need it and such. So there are lots of people who care about these kids. And next slide. But I'm not going to say but also in the past few years, there have been more questions Like we're watching over these kids and helping keep them safe. But what we had been missing in a lot of cases was that these kids need to learn resiliency. They need to be able to make mistakes and especially to be involved in their care. So what often happens, it can be problematic, is say the kids want to be involved in something but can't be because of all the rules around foster care. So say like they want to do an overnight, but if they do, every person there would have to have a background check. So that can be difficult. Or like to be involved in activities, maybe their foster parents don't have time to take them, so we have to find someone else to take them. And so it's more work, but this has become more topic of conversation because these kids sometimes, or a lot of times, are not able to build the skills they need to be able to transition into adulthood, and that leaves them vulnerable to trafficking, to being in criminal justice and homelessness, which is not what we want. So we need to think on that, and like this conversation keeps going because a lot of people are invested in wanting things to be better and wanting to work through these difficulties. So I think it is getting better. We're helping these kids to be more resilient. And a couple other issues I wanted to bring up were about LGBTQ youth in foster care. They represent about 14% of kids in foster care, which is more than double the general population, and for various reasons. But this is a huge concern that we need to make sure that we're addressing the reasons why they're going into foster care in the first place, and also that we're meeting their needs. Like they haven't always been put in a home that's safe for them or that's compassionate towards them, and then they'll be run away, or then they'll be in another placement, and that's an issue. So those are things that have been discussed, and I think that it's gotten better, making sure that the child is placed in a safe and supportive environment. And it's also true for children of different cultures, disabilities, making children with physical disabilities are more likely to be in care. And then race, of course, children of color are more likely to be taken from their birth families and more likely to spend longer in foster care. So that's a conversation. It needs to be equitable for everyone. And then like things like, will the kids be able to practice their religious beliefs? Are they, back in the day, they were kind of forced to become, whatever religion their orphanage was or their family was. But now that's not necessarily the case. We want them to be able to choose their own. So these are kind of ongoing issues that we continue to discuss and hopefully make better for these children. Hopefully there'll be less children in foster care and more placed with loving families. I just kind of wanted to go back to where we started in conclusion. I think, again, I've seen a lot of people in this community who do care about these kids and are out there trying to help. I think of course, there's more opportunity to do so. There's volunteering, there's, financial and contributions. You could become a CASA and be an advocate for these kids and or a mentor. So that's just something to think about as we want to take care of the children in our communities, and every person's worth, and treating people fairly and kindly, and accepting one another. So I thank you for your time. And now I've put together some discussion questions.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Harmony UU podcast. Check us out online at harmonyuu.org for more details. You can also find us on Facebook. Just search Harmony UU. If you're in the Cincinnati area, please stop by one of our services on the first and third Sunday of each month at 10 a.m.